The story is one of the most beautiful a nation ever told about itself. In the summer of 1940, Britain stands alone against Hitler, the last light left in a conquered Europe. And into the blue skies over southern England climbs a handful of young men in Spitfires and hurricanes the few who through sheer courage and daring beat back the mighty Luftwaffe and save their island from invasion. Never, as Churchill said, was so much owed by so many to so few. Every part of that is emotionally true. The pilots were astonishingly brave. Many of them were barely out of school. Hundreds of them died. Their courage was real, and it mattered, and nothing in this story takes an ounce of it away. But as an explanation of how the Battle of Britain was actually won, the legend of the few is misleading, and it hides the far more remarkable truth. Because Britain did not survive that summer, because a few plucky heroes improvised a miracle in the sky. Britain survived because, years before a single shot was fired, it had quietly built something no other country on earth possessed. A machine for winning exactly this battle. Here is the thing the romantic version leaves out. The Battle of Britain was not primarily won in the summer of 1940. It was won in the 1930s in radar towers and telephone exchanges and underground control rooms, in aircraft factories and on drawing boards, in a set of unglamorous decisions made by men most people have never heard of. The pilots were the sharp point of the spear, but the spear itself, the thing that let a smaller air force defeat a larger one, was a system. And that system, not the individual heroics, is the true origin of the victory. This matters because the myth of the lone hero is a comforting story that gets the lesson exactly backwards. It tells us Britain was saved by improvised courage against the odds. The truth is that Britain was saved by foresight, engineering, organization, and industrial muscle, by planning for the war before it came, and building the tools to win it in advance. Courage was necessary, it was not sufficient. What made it work was the machine underneath. So this is the story historians tell that the legend leaves out. The story of the difficult, far-sighted commander who saw the whole thing coming. The story of the world's first integrated air defense network and how it let Britain see the enemy in the sky and direct its fighters like pieces on a board. The story of the factories that replaced fighters faster than Germany could shoot them down. The story of the Polish and Czech and Commonwealth pilots the word few conveniently forgets. And the story of the German mistakes that handed Britain its survival. Put those together, and the Battle of Britain stops being a miracle and becomes something better. A victory that was engineered. It begins not with a pilot, but with a man behind a desk who almost no one remembers. A stiff, unpopular air marshal who spent the 1930s preparing for a battle everyone else assumed could not be won. In the years before the Second World War, the conventional wisdom about air power was pure despair. It was captured in a single grim phrase that echoed through the 1930s. The bomber will always get through. The belief was that no defense could stop a determined bombing force, that enemy planes would inevitably reach their targets, flatten cities, and there was essentially nothing to be done about it but build your own bombers and threaten the same in return. Defense was widely considered a waste of effort. The future, everyone agreed, belonged to attack. One senior officer refused to accept that. His name was Hugh Dowding, and he was, by most accounts, not an easy man, austere, reserved, awkward in the politics of the Royal Air Force, nicknamed Stuffy behind his back. He was exactly the kind of unglamorous figure that legends tend to skip over. But Dowding possessed the one quality that would save his country. He took the problem of defense seriously when almost no one else would, and he was willing to bet on new technology and cold organization to solve it. As the head of Fighter Command, Dowding understood a brutal piece of arithmetic. If you cannot see the enemy coming, defending against air raids is nearly hopeless. Without warning, your only option is to fly constant patrols, hoping to stumble across the attackers by luck. That burns out your pilots, wears out your engines, and still leaves the sky mostly empty at the moment the bombers actually arrive. A defending fighter force without early warning is almost worthless, no matter how brave its pilots. You would need to be everywhere at once, and no air force can be everywhere at once. So Dowding seized on a new and secret invention that promised to change that equation entirely. In the mid-1930s, British scientists, led by Robert Watson Watt, had demonstrated that radio waves could detect aircraft at a distance, bouncing a signal off a plane and reading the echo to reveal its position long before any human eye could see it. It was called radio direction finding. We know it today as radar. Here, potentially, was the answer to the bomber problem, a way to see the enemy while he was still far out over the sea. But this is the genius that the story usually misses. Radar by itself was not enough. A screen showing blips is useless unless that information can be gathered, checked, combined, and rushed to the exact squadron that needs it, in time to get fighters into the air and to the right place and altitude before the enemy arrives. Raw data is not victory. Radar told you the enemy was coming. It did not by itself put a Spitfire in his path. What Dowding grasped, and what made him one of the quiet architects of the 20th century, was that the real weapon was not the radar set. It was the whole system that turned radar into action. And through the late 1930s, working with an obsessive attention to detail, Dowding oversaw the construction of the world's first integrated air defense system, a network that would come to bear his name. It was, in effect, a war-fighting nervous system, built and tested and wired together before the shooting ever started. When the German bombers finally came in the summer of 1940, they would fly straight into it, and most of them never understood what they were fighting. Dowding did not run the daily battle alone. The brunt of the fighting fell on the group covering southeast England and London, commanded by a lean, cool-headed New Zealander named Keith Park, who flew his own Hurricane between his airfields and became a master of feeding fighters into the battle a squadron at a time, exactly where the system said they were needed. Park's careful, economical tactics were controversial, even within the RAF. Another commander to his north argued instead for gathering fighters into a single massive formation, the so-called Big Wing, before striking. The debate grew bitter, and in one of the great injustices of the story, both Dowding and Park, the two men most responsible for the victory, were pushed aside within months of winning it. The architects of the machine were quietly removed once the machine had done its work. Another reason the system, and the men who built it, faded behind the legend of the pilots. To see why the Battle of Britain was won on the ground, you have to understand how the Dowding system actually worked, because there had never been anything like it in the history of war. It began at the coast, with a chain of tall towers strung along the shores of Britain facing the enemy. These were the radar stations, known as Chain Home, backed by a set of smaller stations designed to catch low-flying aircraft. By the summer of 1940, there were around 20 of the main stations and 30 of the smaller ones, forming an electronic fence along the threatened coastline. As German formations gathered over France and pushed out across the Channel, the radar caught them while they were still far out over the water, giving Britain something no defender had ever reliably had before: minutes of warning and a rough count of how many were coming and from where. Radar, though, looked outward over the sea. Once the enemy crossed the coast and flew inland, the radar could no longer track them, and so the system handed off to human eyes. This was the Observer Corps, thousands of volunteers at posts across the country, armed with binoculars and telephones, who watched the skies and reported the aircraft passing overhead. Together, radar out to sea and observers over the land created a continuous, moving picture of every raid. Now came the part that was truly revolutionary. What happened to all that information? Every radar reading and every observer's report flooded by telephone into a central filter room at Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory. There, in real time, staff took this torrent of raw, sometimes contradictory reports and filtered them cross-checking, resolving duplicates, turning a chaos of blips and sightings into a single, trusted picture of what was actually in the sky. That filtered picture was then passed down to group and sector operations rooms, where controllers plotted the raids on great map tables and watched the battle unfold like a living board game. Around those tables stood teams of young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, headsets on, using long rakes to push wooden markers across the map, as the reports came in the human hands that kept the whole living picture moving, minute by minute. It is one more group the word few leaves out entirely. And from those rooms, the controllers reached back up into the air. By radio, they directed their fighter squadrons, telling them where the enemy was, how many, how high, and which way to turn to meet them. For the first time in history, a commander on the ground could see an air battle as a whole and move his forces around it in real time, concentrating them exactly where they were needed and holding back the rest. Think about what that gave Britain. The Royal Air Force was outnumbered. It could not afford to waste a single fighter. Without the system, Fighter Command would have had to fly endless, exhausting patrols and still miss most of the raids. With it, the fighters could sit safely on the ground, pilots resting, engines cool and then scramble at the last minute, climbing straight to an enemy whose position was already known. It let a smaller force fight as if it were larger, appearing again and again right where the Germans did not want it. The Luftwaffe pilots were baffled. They had been told the RAF was nearly finished, yet everywhere they went, British fighters were waiting for them, as if the defenders could read their minds. They could not read minds. They could read radar. The invisible weapon that beat the Luftwaffe was not in the cockpit at all. It was the web of towers, telephones, filter rooms, and controllers that turned scattered information into fighters in the right place at the right time. That is the true origin of the victory, and it was built years before the few ever climbed into their planes. The system told Britain where to fight, but to keep fighting, it needed two other things. The legend tends to forget: enough aircraft to replace its losses and enough pilots to fly them. And on both counts, the real story is very different from the myth of a tiny, purely British band holding out against impossible odds. Start with the aircraft, because this is where the Battle of Britain was quietly won behind the scenes. An air battle of attrition is, at bottom, A race, can you replace your losses faster than the enemy destroys them? And here Britain did something remarkable. In May 1940, with the crisis at its height, Churchill put a ruthless, energetic newspaper baron named Lord Beaverbrook in charge of a new Ministry of Aircraft Production and told him to get fighters built by any means necessary. Beaverbrook bullied, improvised, cut through red tape, and drove the factories mercilessly. The results were astonishing. Between February and the summer of 1940, British fighter production more than tripled, climbing from around 140 aircraft a month to nearly 500. And here is the fact that turns the whole David and Goliath image on its head. During the Battle of Britain, Britain outproduced Germany in fighter aircraft, and not by a little. The RAF was building fighters roughly 2.5 times faster than the Germans were, repairing damaged machines by the hundreds and returning them to the fight. The consequence was one of the most important and least famous facts of the battle. As the fighting ground on through that summer, the number of German fighters available to attack England actually fell while the number of British fighters rose. The Luftwaffe was wearing itself out. Fighter command, thanks to the factories, was getting stronger even as it bled. The Germans kept believing they were grinding the RAF down to its last few planes. In reality, Britain had more fighters at the end of the battle than at the start. The myth says Britain won against overwhelming material odds. The truth is that, in the thing that mattered most, replacing fighters, Britain was winning the industrial war all along. 2 more corrections belong here, because the popular picture gets them wrong too. The first is the aircraft itself. When people picture the Battle of Britain, they see the Spitfire sleek, beautiful, iconic. But the Spitfire was actually the rarer of Britain's 2 fighters in that battle. The workhorse was the sturdier, less glamorous Hawker Hurricane, which equipped more squadrons and shot down more German aircraft than the Spitfire did. The machine that did the most killing was the one no one made films about. The second, and more sobering, is that the true bottleneck was never really the planes at all. Thanks to Beaverbrook's factories, Britain always had aircraft. What it came dangerously close to running out of was pilots. Trained fighter pilots cannot be stamped out of a factory in a week. They take months to make. And in the brutal attrition of late August and early September, Fighter Command's shortage of experienced men to put in its cockpits was the real crisis. That is the hidden knife edge of the battle, not a lack of Spitfires, but a lack of the young men to fly them, being lost faster than they could be replaced. Then there is the other half of the myth, the word few, and the assumption that they were all British. They were not. Fighter Command in 1940 was strikingly international, and the battle could not have been won without the men. The legend leaves out. The largest and most famous of these contingents were the Poles. After their own country was crushed in 1939, Polish airmen made their way to Britain, burning to fight the Germans again, and they turned out to be some of the deadliest pilots in the entire battle. Around 145 Poles flew in the Battle of Britain. Their own 303 squadron became the single highest-scoring RAF squadron of the whole battle, tearing into German formations with a ferocity that startled their British commanders. The Poles, a small fraction of Fighter Command's strength, accounted for a strikingly large share of its kills, at a lopsided ratio in their favour. They were experienced, they were motivated by the loss of their homeland, and they fought like it. And it was not only the Poles. Czech pilots, also refugees from a conquered nation, fought superbly. So did Canadians, New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, Belgians, Free French, a handful of Americans, and others from across the Commonwealth and occupied Europe. Roughly 1 in 5 of the pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain was not British. The few were, in truth, the international few, a coalition of the exiled, the volunteer, and the imperial, fighting a common enemy in British skies. The comforting national legend of an island standing alone quietly writes them out. The honest history puts them back where they belong, at the centre of the fight. There is one more piece the myth leaves out, and it is an uncomfortable one for a heroic story. Britain did not only win the Battle of Britain. In important ways, Germany lost it through weaknesses and blunders of its own that had nothing to do with the courage of the few. Start with the Luftwaffe itself. For all its fearsome reputation, the German Air Force had been built for the wrong war. It was designed above all to support fast-moving armies on the ground, to smash a path for the tanks in a lightning campaign. It was never built to fight a long, independent air war to break a nation across the sea. Crucially, it had no fleet of heavy, long-range strategic bombers capable of pounding Britain into submission. Its bombers were medium machines with modest loads, and they were desperately vulnerable without escorts. And the escorts had a fatal flaw. The Luftwaffe's main fighter, the Messerschmitt 109, was an excellent aircraft with one crippling limitation over Britain: range. Flying from bases in occupied France, it could reach London, but only just. Once over the city, a 109 pilot had perhaps 10 minutes of fighting time before his fuel gauge forced him to turn for home or ditch in the Channel. 10 minutes. The German bombers were flying into the teeth of the Dowding system with fighter escorts that could barely stay long enough to protect them. It was a structural weakness no amount of skill could fix. On top of these built-in problems, the Germans made a catastrophic decision at the worst possible moment. Through late August and early September of 1940, the Luftwaffe had, almost by accident, hit on the strategy most likely to win. It was hammering Fighter Command's airfields and its radar and control stations attacking the system itself. And it was working. The sector airfields in southeast England were battered, exhausted, and close to the breaking point. Historians widely agree this was the most dangerous moment of the battle for Britain, the point at which the machine that was winning the war might have been smashed. And then, at that exact moment, the Germans changed targets. Stung by British bombing raids on Berlin, and convinced the RAF was nearly finished anyway, the Luftwaffe switched its main effort on the 7th of September to bombing London directly at the beginning of the Blitz against the city. For the people of London, it was the start of a long ordeal, but for Fighter Command, it was salvation. The pressure came off the battered airfields and the control system at the critical instant. Given a chance to breathe, Fighter Command recovered, and it was ready and waiting when the great daylight raids came again. On the 15th of September, the RAF met the Luftwaffe in force over southern England and hit it hard, in the action now remembered as Battle of Britain Day. 2 days later, Hitler postponed his planned invasion of Britain indefinitely. It never came. It is worth adding a note of honesty even here, because good history resists tidy fairy tales in both directions. Some historians argue that a German invasion may never have been truly feasible in the first place, that even if the Luftwaffe had won complete control of the air, the Royal Navy still stood between Hitler's barges and the English coast, and might well have shattered any crossing. The Battle of Britain may have been less the razor's edge of national survival than the legend insists, and more the decisive proof that Germany could not achieve the air supremacy its invasion plan required. That does not diminish the achievement, it sharpens what the achievement actually was. So gather the whole picture and see how far it is from the myth. The Battle of Britain was not won by a handful of lone heroes improvising a miracle in a desperate summer. It was won by a far-sighted commander who prepared for the impossible, by the world's first integrated air defense system built in the 1930s that let a smaller force see and strike with deadly efficiency, by factories that outbuilt the enemy and replaced fighters faster than they could be shot down, by Polish, Czech and Commonwealth pilots the word few forgets, and by a German enemy that was built for the wrong war and threw away its best chance at the decisive moment. The courage of the pilots was absolutely real, and it sat at the heart of all of it. But courage was the tip of the spear, not the spear. The true origin of the victory was the machine, the foresight and the engineering and the organization and the industry that Britain assembled before the war and then wielded during it. That is the lesson the beautiful legend of the few quietly buries. Britain was not saved by a miracle. It was saved because, while others said the bomber would always get through, a few unglamorous people decided to build the thing that would stop it, and then, in the summer of 1940, it did.